What I really want to talk about, though, today is probably something, it's not completely explicit in the text, but it's all in the context of not only this part of Genesis, but everywhere that we're going to go for many, many books of the Old Testament. And that's polygamy in the Old Testament and how it functions. We think about Old Testament polygamy and we think about Latter-day Saint polygamy of 150 years ago, right?
Right.
It is so understandable to me that a lot more feelings come up about the more recent polygamy, and yet there's some real similarities between the two
There's some
systems.
big similarities. And so that is actually very similar to the way that sealings work. So when a woman is married and sealed to a man and say he dies, and so she marries somebody else and they are not sealed because she doesn't cancel her sealing to her first husband. Any children that she has with her new husband actually in the next life are sealed to her deceased husband.
They're born under whatever sealing is current for her.
Yes. Children follow the mother's sealing. So it's kind of the same principle. That's why you see the things with like Sylvia Sessions where she told her daughter that she was Joseph's daughter. She wasn't his biological daughter. She was technically Joseph's daughter because she was born under the sealing.
Isn't that interesting?
Do you think that it is a little different just because, our society, our Western society is very, very different from the ancient Near East? Again, with our more recent plural marriages, it was always a choice.
Yeah.
Joseph was always very clear and all of the other apostles and later leaders of the church, they were all very clear. It was the woman's choice. If she said no, she said no. If she wanted to leave the marriage, she could leave the marriage. Divorce, we had no-fault divorce in Utah long before it was the national standard, and that was strictly for plural marriages.
Hello, welcome back to Fair's Come Follow Me podcast, Old Testament Year. I am Jennifer Roach Lees, and today I am joined again by our friend Sarah Allen. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. We are on week 9, and we're still in Genesis. We are in Genesis 18 to 23. There's a lot going on in these chapters. We could have gone so many different directions. What I really want to talk about, though, today is probably something, it's not completely explicit in the text, but it's all in the context of not only this part of Genesis, but everywhere that we're going to go for many, many books of the Old Testament. And that's polygamy in the Old Testament and how it functions. Sarah is the world's best researcher, my personal favorite researcher.
Thank you.
So I wanted to have her on to talk about some of this stuff. Sarah, could you say a little bit about just what's the construct of polygamy in the Old Testament? What was it like?
Okay, so in the ancient Near East, polygamy was standard. It was a normal part of life. It was a symbol of wealth and status. If your husband made enough, like if he was wealthy enough, he had another wife, at least one, usually many more. He also probably had some concubines. It was just a position of power and wealth and status. It was how many wives that you had. Yeah. And sometimes men of lower status also had multiple wives, like if their wife was barren or something, or maybe the problem was him. I don't know.
Yeah.
But if he wasn't having kids with his first wife, he would take on a second wife or a concubine or somebody to try and have an heir.
Since the word has come up, I was going to ask you later, but they had a really, really different marriage system than we do.
Yes.
And sometimes people hear that word concubine and they think mistress. I've heard prostitute.
Side piece. Yeah.
Yes, side piece.
Yeah, right.
Could you talk, what is a concubine?
Okay, so a concubine was none of those things.
Thank you.
She was a woman generally of a lower social status. She did have a legal arrangement with, it was a legally binding contract. Mm-hmm. It was a little lower status of a wife. Generally, she came from a lower social status. So she did not have a dowry or a bride price or anything like that. But she still had this legal arrangement. It was still a marriage. You see often in the Old Testament, sometimes in one verse they'll call one of the women a wife, and then in another verse they'll call her a concubine. Because they were basically interchangeable. They were just wives of a lower class.
Okay.
So you had the wives of status, and then you had the wives of lower status, but they were all still wives.
Okay. So they're not like little secret side pieces. Okay.
No. It's basically I would say maybe the difference between a civil marriage and a church marriage.
Sure.
I mean, they're still all legally binding marriages, just one maybe has a little more status for Christians or Muslims or whatever. Sometimes Unfortunately, they were slaves.
Or maybe if a city had been invaded and they're the spoils of war.
Yeah. Unfortunately, women were not really seen as much more than property at the time, which is horrible. They did have like rights and they did have legal standing. So even the slaves, the husband was not allowed to sell his concubine if she was a slave.
Okay.
So he couldn't just sell her to somebody else when he got tired of her.
Yeah.
He still had to keep her and protect her, and she was still his wife.
Okay. We think about Old Testament polygamy and we think about Latter-day Saint polygamy of 150 years ago, right?
Right.
And it is so understandable to me that a lot more feelings come up about the more recent polygamy. You come from a polygamous line.
I do,
right?
Yes.
As do many, many, many people in the church. So these are your maybe maybe three great-grandparents that we're talking about, not people 4,000 years ago.
Right.
But sometimes people think of polygamy in the Old Testament and really just don't have any feelings about it because we don't know any of those people. We don't know their culture.
Right, it was so long ago.
And yet, there's some real similarities between the two systems.
There's some big similarities.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Under the law of Moses, there was something called levirate marriage. That was when, say, your husband dies. And so his brother was one of his brothers was legally obligated to marry you, especially if you didn't have children. And so any children that you had with him were considered heirs of your deceased husband.
This is what we're seeing in like the book of Ruth.
Yes.
Boaz is not her husband's brother, but he is a relative.
Right.
He has to check and see, actually, I think, if there's a closer relative before he can like take her.
Right. Yeah, because it's supposed to be a brother or a close relative if he doesn't have a brother.
It sounds like a weird marriage.
Yeah. It was a legal marriage, and so they didn't care if you could afford it or not. You were legally obligated. You had to do this under the law of Moses. And so that is actually very similar to the way that sealings work. So when a woman is married and sealed to a man and say he dies, and so she marries somebody else and they are not sealed because she doesn't cancel her sealing to her first husband. Any children that she has with her new husband actually in the next life are sealed to her deceased husband.
They're
her first husband.
Born under whatever sealing is current for her.
Yes. Children follow the mother's sealing. So it's kind of the same principle. That's why you see some of the things with like Sylvia Sessions where she told her daughter that she was Joseph's daughter. She wasn't his biological daughter, but she was technically Joseph's daughter because she was born under the sealing.
Isn't that interesting? When we think about Old Testament polygamy, it's way easier to say like, oh, that was the system back then and women were property and they didn't have any rights. And it feels so much harder when we talk about more recent polygamy of like, well, wait a minute, these women's rights are being violated. Could you like kind of just talk about that part a little bit?
I do think that it is a little different just because, our society, our Western society is very, very different from the ancient Near East. Again, with our more recent plural marriages, it was always a choice.
Yeah.
Joseph was always very clear, and all of the other apostles and later leaders of the church, they were all very clear. It was the woman's choice. If she said no, she said no. If she wanted to leave the marriage, she could leave the marriage. Divorce, we had no-fault divorce in Utah long before it was the national standard, and that was strictly for plural marriages. Women actually had a little bit more freedom. They generally were a little bit more independent. They had more say over the household. Some of them were able to get like better educations and to have careers and things that they otherwise would not have had if they were the only wife. So it was a different system. In the ancient Near East, obviously things were different, and those women did unfortunately have fewer rights than we would have had in the United States.
A woman in the Old Testament, if she wants a divorce, even if that could be granted to her, how's she going to support herself? There's no path for her.
She can't.
Yeah.
She can't. All of her rights came from her husband. And so if she were unmarried, if she were like divorced, she was kind of seen as like an outcast. If she were widowed and there was nobody to step up and marry her, then she was kind of seen as like a charity case. And she was like a burden to her family if she was unmarried and single. Whatever rights she had either came from her father or her husband. Yeah. And so if she didn't have a husband, then she was basically a burden on her family.
Yeah, which is interesting that like that is one of the differences between the two systems.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What else would you say are like similarities or differences between the two?
Well, I do believe that it was a commandment in both times. Under the law of Moses, they actually were a little more progressive. We see the law of Moses as being very restrictive, but it actually was more progressive than the other laws in the ancient Near East at the time.
They're like neighboring countries had harder laws.
Yeah, much harsher laws. I do see a little more freedom and protection of women under the law of Moses, and I do see the same thing in the Nauvoo and the Utah polygamy era. A lot of it was geared toward protecting women because, again, women's rights in the United States in the 1800s were very different from what they are today. Single women typically were able to have a little bit more freedom than married women, but like women could not own property independent of their husband. They could not vote. They had very little say in anything. And so the plural marriage system, as backward as it kind of sounds, actually gave them more freedom. And Utah was actually one of the very first territories to grant women the right to vote.
That's right.
Congress stripped it of us because women were voting in favor of plural marriage. But I believe it was a daughter of Brigham Young, or like a niece of Brigham Young, was the first woman to vote in the entire country.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So I can almost hear the voice of a skeptic or kind of a naysayer in the back of my head saying like, well, wait a minute. Doctrine and Covenant 132, Emma's being threatened. If you don't agree to this, like you're going to die, which is not really what it says.
No,
but that's
no,
sort of the
it's not.
exaggeration of, no, they weren't actually free. Like this is coercion. How have you personally come to reconcile all that?
There are a lot of scriptures that talk about destroying, where the Lord says he will destroy somebody. And sometimes that is a physical death, but sometimes, like in the case of Alma the Younger, it is a spiritual death, like the end of progression. Yeah. And if you actually look at the footnote in D&C 132 on that word where it says destroyed, it takes you back to D&C 25, which was the other blessing given to Emma. And in verse 15, I think it's verse 15, is the footnote. And that actually reminds her that if she does not keep the commandments, she can't go where God is. And so that's basically what it's kind of bringing it back full circle and just reminding her. She was, unfortunately, totally understandable. Like, I have all the sympathy in the world for her. I would be upset too. But she was fighting against the commandment. She was fighting against the prophet, and she was trying to undermine that. Basically, the entire section is covenants and sacrifices and trials, and then the blessings that we get if we keep our covenants despite those trials, and then the consequences if we don't. And so it was just a reminder, just if you keep those commandments, you will be blessed in these ways. And if you don't, then that is going to be the end of your progression. You can't come to where I am.
If you were going to break any commandment, if you decided like, I'm just going to be a liar and I'm just going to live my life based on lies and I'm just going to like bamboozle everybody, that will destroy you. That's not going to be a good life for you in any way.
No, it's not. And what Emma was being asked to do was a very incredibly difficult thing. I do not envy her in the slightest. I would not want to be in that position either. I totally get it. But it was a commandment, and it was something that she was being asked to do. And I do liken that to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. You know, that was her big Abrahamic sacrifice that she had to make. And sometimes the Lord does ask really horrible, hard things of us. We can either suck it up and do what he asks, or we can fall away. And that's kind of what he was reminding her.
When Joseph is alive, working on restoring many, many ancient things, at that time, would they have said, oh, polygamy is just one of the ancient things that is being restored? Or would they have seen it as, this is different than what was happening. This is a different system. We're not restoring what was happening in the Old Testament. We're doing something different. What do you think?
I'm not entirely sure. We do know that the questions came up first when Joseph was reading in the Old Testament and he was seeing these patriarchs, and he wanted to know if that was okay or if that was like considered adultery or like what is going on. And then he also said that a lot of it came in response to in Matthew, where he was reading about the verse of those who are neither married nor given in marriage. He was confused. He was like, what exactly does this mean? What is going on here? What is this? And I think that's kind of a combination of the two. And so in that regard, I do think that he believed it was a restoration. But at the same time, I think he was a little surprised that it came that way. And I don't blame him. I would be surprised too. I'd be like, what? You can see that he was really reluctant. It took him several years to where he finally was like, okay. And he had to be threatened multiple times by an angel telling him, you have to do this. And then even after he started doing it, he had to be threatened again because he was being sealed to these women who are already married to other people. And the angel came back to him and was like, you are not doing this right.
A nice try, buddy.
Yeah, he was like, you are looking for loopholes. Yeah. Stop it. You have to start marrying these single women too. I mean, obviously, the women who were married to other people, they knew. Several of them had dreams that they were married to Joseph and were like, what? Yeah. And then they were introduced to practice and they went, oh my gosh, like this is actually what I am supposed to be doing. So some of them obviously were set apart for that. But yeah, he got threatened over that and had to move away from the married women.
Right. It does remind me of maybe 2 years ago at the fair conference in August. That would have been 23, I think, Don Bradley's talk on Joseph's sealing to pregnant women.
Yes.
If you have not watched that one, it is absolutely so worth a watch.
Fantastic, yeah.
The polyandry aspect, when I was investigating the church, I was like, okay, polygamy is in the Old Testament, whatever, you're going to do that now, okay, fine. And then I was like, what? He's also marrying women who are married? And like now, like, oh, like, theologically, I see how it's making sense.
Right, because what we were talking about before, like the elaborate marriage and the sealings, and those children technically would be born under the sealing covenant, and so they would be his posterity. And so he was fulfilling the law of having posterity with these plural wives without having sex.
Isn't that funny?
I know. And the angel finally was like
nice try, buddy.
No, you have to actually live this. And you see that same reluctance from all of them. Mm-hmm. Like all of the early participants in their journals and their letters and stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, like Brigham Young, how he wished he was dead.
Right? Oh, buddy. I also think he got used to it.
Clearly he did, yeah. And like Heber C. Kimball, another one. Yeah. I mean, there are stories of him just crying and stressing out, like being physically ill over this because he couldn't tell his wife. And he was like, I am like, please, you know, and then she had a vision of the celestial kingdom when she was praying about it. And so, and like she saw plural marriage in the celestial kingdom. So she knew.
One of my favorite, also Fair Talk, August 2020, Laura Harris Hales gives a talk on what did the women who were involved in polygamy, specifically with Joseph Smith, what did they say about it later in their lives? And sometimes, maybe not in the church, although sometimes definitely like former members or whatnot will say, oh, I can't believe Joseph did this and he married this girl and she was too young. And like, okay, well, she also grew up and had her own voice and could speak about her own experience of that. And we sort of erase women when we take our values and say, no, I bet she hated it, when literally she has different thoughts on it.
Absolutely. All of them were, not all of them, there were a few who left the church afterward.
They were also monogamous who left the church.
Right. But the women, especially those who were married to Joseph, who remained faithful in the church, were very pro-polygamy in their writings and also in their private conversations. That's not to say that it was easy. Obviously, it was a very difficult thing. It was stressful. It was hard. But one of the things that most of them referred to was the sisterhood that came with it. Like they were very close friends with their sister wives. And that was something completely unexpected that they had not anticipated at all. They formed these very close bonds with these women. A lot of them said it's not a system of love. It's about commandments and duty. It's what we're asked to do, and so we're doing it. But they all had very strong testimonies of it. And a lot of Joseph's wives in particular had visions of angels. One couple was surrounded by a halo of light while they were praying. 3 different women had visions of the celestial kingdom. They had intense spiritual experiences because they were being asked to do something incredibly difficult and horrible.
So they probably needed intense experiences.
Yeah, they needed that to lean back on and be like, no, I know for a fact that this is true because I had that incredible experience.
When we think about Old Testament polygamy, because the Hebrew culture and the cultures all around it are already set up for polygamy, I imagine there wasn't this like jarring transition point where the standard is monogamy and then they're having to move into polygamy. So
no, it was just how things were. You see that also with the later generations in Utah after it had already been established towards the end of like the 50-year period. It was just how things were.
Your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents?
Yeah. Something like half of all households had somebody in them who was either a child living in a polygamous household or had parents who were involved in it or family members who were involved in it. So they all were very used to it. Like it was just part of life.
Other thoughts about Old Testament polygamy? If there was something you could tell people on that topic, what would you want them to know?
I would say one of the things that you hear a lot is that they're held up as examples of negative examples to show that polygamy is wrong. But that's not actually what you see, because the 12 tribes of Israel came from a polygamous marriage. The Savior, his lineage, the descendants of David, house of David, all polygamous. I think that's probably a fairly good indication that God is actually okay with it under certain circumstances. If he's going to have his chosen people come from plural marriage and he's going to have his son come from a plural marriage.
Line, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably speaks a little bit more volumes than not.
This subheading from the Come Follow Me manual for Doctrine and Covenants year on 132 was something like plural marriage is allowed when God says so. Yeah. That was the big takeaway from that lesson, and I think that's a beautiful example of this is one tool among many. How families are brought about and developed and how God's work is brought about and developed, not permanent. I might have told you this at some point. When I was investigating the church, the first time I went to Fast and Testimony meeting, a very elderly man, who I actually later got to know a little bit. He was an incredibly kind man, but he works really hard to get up to the podium, and he gets up there and the first thing he says is, I'm such and such years old. I'm 90 years old. And I really thought polygamy would have come back by now. I'm sitting with my friend, Heather, and she just grabs my hand and she's like, we'll talk about it later. But just the idea of this happens when God says it happens and not when he doesn't.
I've never heard anybody say that in sacrament. I'm just saying.
It was my very first one. I had actually kind of been involved with the ward a little bit, but I hadn't attended a Fast and Testimony meeting yet. So a lot of people actually knew me already. And I could feel everybody forward to be like, is she bolting? Is she running? Any other closing thoughts about polygamy, Old Testament or otherwise?
I firmly believe that it does come from God at certain times and under certain circumstances. And I understand that there are hard feelings about it. But when God commands you to do something, you have to make a choice.
Yep, even when it's hard. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate all the information that you always bring. Come back next week. We'll pick up in Genesis 24, and I will see you then.